Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're in for a treat because we're going to take a trip back in time to the tent at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, and we have with us our very special guest, Pastor Chuck Smith. Pastor Chuck, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you today.
Pastor Chuck, I moved to the United States in 1981 and started to hear about this extraordinary Jesus People revival that I'd never heard of. I didn't know that so much history came out of that tent that you set up there, and I thought it'd be great if our listeners could learn a bit, because not all of them are geriatrics like me, and so many of them are young people who tune in to K-Wave and other stations. They know the beautiful worship music you have, but they have no idea this extraordinary history. And I understand your wife Kay is partly to blame for this, for you getting involved with the hippies. Is that true, that she forced you to go and witness to them at Huntington Beach Pier?
Actually, it is true that I had the thought and all concerning hippies that, why don't you get a bath and get a job and, get a life. And but she was totally fascinated by them. And she said, they are so desperately in need of Jesus. And what she had observed is this young girl, pretty young girl, that was just high on drugs, so high that she really didn't know where she was, what she was doing, attempting to cross the street and in heavy traffic. And she just, her heart just went out to this young girl. And she said, we've got to reach them. They've got to know a different life. They've got to know of Jesus. And so she would have me drive her over to Huntington Beach and down to Laguna Beach and all, just to observe these kids. And she'd, I would be sitting there watching them staggering down the street, and I'd be thinking, what a shame, and why don't you get a job and all. And I'd look over and she'd be weeping, and just had such a tremendous burden for them. And so it was through her burden that we actually became involved in reaching out to the young people.
So when you went to Huntington Beach Pier, did you start eventually talking to them, or what happened?
Well, actually what had happened is that our daughter was in the University of Irvine at that time, and she had met a young man who she was going with, dating for a while, and he had a very powerful personal witness for Jesus Christ. He was just, he'd come over to pick her up, and we'd be talking to him, and they would drive together down to Laguna Beach, and he would say, well, last night when we were down there, a group of 4 kids came walking down. They were stoned, and so I shared with them, and they all ended up, kneeling there on the sidewalk and accepting the Lord. And he had these stories almost every day of the way God was using him in witnessing. And so my wife said, John, we want to meet a hippie, a real honest-to-goodness hippie. She was curious as to what made them tick. How did they get so far off base? And so John then showed us his driver's license, and we were shocked because he was a normal-looking young man. But his driver's license, he had long hair and the whole thing. And he had been in the hippie life himself. And so one night the doorbell rang, and we went to the door, and it was John, but he had this long-haired hippie with him that had, flowers in his hair and bells on his cuffs and so forth. And he looked a lot like some of the pictures of Jesus, with a beard and all. And he said, Chuck, I want you to meet Lonnie. And he was so engaging and so warm, this Lonnie. And what had happened is that John was driving by Orange Coast College, and he had a habit of always picking up hippies so he could witness to them. And so he saw this hippie hitchhiking, and so he stopped to pick him up. And so he said to him, well, where are you going? And the kid said, well, I'm not really going anywhere special. I just hitchhike in order that I can witness to the people who pick me up. And John said, well, that's why I picked you up, so I could witness to you. And he said, you've got to come over and meet some people. So he brought them over to the house, and that's where we got acquainted with the hippie culture.
That's amazing. So very soon you had this smallish church, was it, on Sunflower, was it, where you were originally?
Well, no, actually at that time we were using the Lutheran church in Newport Beach, planning to move into it when they had built their new church. And so actually we had built the church out on Sunflower later on, just before we moved into the tent. But it was we were in the Lutheran church when the hippie movement really hit the church.
So a lot of hippies started to come along to the church, and was that causing uproar in the church when all these smelly old hippies would come, not wearing shoes and smelling a bit?
I do remember the first night they came in. It was a Wednesday night, and the service had already begun, and about 20 of these, Lonnie had brought these hippies with him, and they came in and they just sat on the aisle, coming in the front, down towards the front of the church, and I can remember the shocked expression of the people and sort of the, just what's happening. And the interesting thing is that their hearts were so filled with the love of Jesus Christ that everybody just immediately fell in love with them. And it wasn't really a hard thing to accept them. We had been, of course, teaching the people 1 John, and the real proof of the Christian life is loving, and so the people did love them and embrace them, and it was an exciting experience.
So presumably you were running out of space pretty quickly, Pastor Chuck. All of a sudden you've got all these hippies arriving. So was that the reason why you put the tent up?
Well, actually, we first built the little chapel on Sunflower, and we built it to accommodate 300 people. And the first Sunday, it was so packed that the kids were on the floor and everything else. And so we thought, well, it's a grand opening Sunday. By next Sunday, we'll be down to the 300, and that the building would accommodate. But the following Sunday, there was really no room even on the floor. So we went to double services, then triple services, then we doubled the size of the auditorium, and then we had people sitting in the patio. In 2 years, we had a phenomenal growth, and that's when we knew we had to build, but we didn't have time to build anything big enough, and so we bought the property where we presently are, but we put up a tent in order to accommodate the crowd that was coming, and so we were 2 years in the tent while we were building our new sanctuary.
Is it true that one of your elders complained that the hippies were ruining the carpet?
Well, it is true that I came to church one Sunday morning, and I saw a sign on the front, and it said, "No bare feet allowed." And it was signed by, it just said, the board, So I was fortunate to be there early, and I took the sign down, and I called a board meeting, and I told them, I said, because we have this beautiful new carpet, we've got to say to one kid, you can't come in because you've got bare feet. I said, let's rip up the carpet and have concrete floors. And I said, if we have to say you can't come because you've got dirty clothes and we don't want you to soil our upholstered pews, then let's get benches and let's, never turn the kid away from the church, So, yes, that was something that did happen.
Can you remember the first night in the tent?
Well, I remember the first Sunday morning. Actually, we had a men's prayer meeting every Saturday night, and so we were at the little chapel, and they were putting up the lights and, getting the chairs all set. And we put 1,600 chairs in the tent. And so after the prayer meeting, the fellows that were there, we went over to the tent to see how they were coming with the preparations, because we would open the next morning, Sunday morning, And I was standing on the platform with one of the fellows who was from the prayer meeting. He was actually a board member at the time, too. And I said, well, Dwayne, as we looked out at this vast sea of chairs, I said, how long do you suppose it will take the Lord to fill this, And he looked at his watch and he said, well, I would say in about 10 hours, And I laughed, Well, of course, the next morning, we decided that we would have double services, one service at 8 o'clock and the other at 10. And at 8 o'clock, the tent was so crowded that there was standing room only. And I thought, now, that is something that is just, foolish. You go from 3 services to 2 services, and so everybody comes the first service. And it'll surely be empty in the second service. And so when the second service came around, it was the same story. The tent was packed and standing room only, and we just realized God is doing a miraculous thing here. And it was just a beautiful experience. Of course, we had to redesign the new sanctuary 3 times before we even got to build it. But, of course, it was a lot cheaper to enlarge it on the drawing board of the architect rather than trying to build it and then enlarge it. So we just, again, saw God doing just a beautiful work.
Now, I remember you once told me a story of baptism. Was it on the first night when you all went in convoy down to Newport Beach and then a helicopter came over? Can you share that story?
Well, actually, this was when we were in the little sanctuary on Sunflower, the first one that we built. And I had a Monday night study with the young people every Monday night. And so we had this girl who was from France. She was one of the exchange students, and foreign exchange student. And so she was going back to France, but she had accepted the Lord and expressed a desire to be baptized. And so I announced that Monday night that after the service, we were going to go down to the 19th Street Beach in Newport and have a baptismal service. And those who would like to come along could come on down. So at the close of the service, we drove on down to the 19th Street Beach. And actually, there were about 50 young people that decided to be baptized that night, along with this girl from France. And as I was baptizing this girl from France, of course, you have all of these hippies that are there on the beach, and of course the neighbors there didn't know what was going on. I guess they called the police. And so as I was bringing her up out of the water, the police helicopter came over and turned their bright spotlight down on the whole beach. And of course, to the young people, it was just a sign from heaven almost, of this bright light from heaven illuminating the whole beach as this girl was coming up out of the water. And it was just one of those wonderful experiences.
Now, a lot of people will not realize how what we call modern-day worship music came out of those hippie days. And I understand that quite a few of the people that received the Lord became Christians, and then they would come and ask if they could sing their song, and you would have to audition them before the service.
True.
So what happened?
Well, this was, of course, on the Monday night service with the young people. And there were many talented young people that were coming in. And I remember I was there in the church on a Monday, and these fellows came by, and they came in and introduced themselves. They said that they were musicians. They had a rock group, and that they had accepted the Lord a couple of weeks prior on a Monday night study, and they wanted that the Lord had been giving them some Christian songs, and they'd like to share them. And so I asked them if they would, if they could, play one for me. So they went out to their van, got their guitars and all, and they came in and they began to play. It was the song "Welcome Back," and it was so anointed, I just started weeping. And I said, "Oh yes," I said, "how about sharing tonight? The kids will love it." And they said, "Well, Fred is doing weekends for a drug bust but he gets off at 5, so we can probably do it tonight. So that was Love Song.
Love Song.
And then, of course, they were so good and so anointed that they inspired other young people to get together and form bands. And at one time we had over 10 different bands that had formed of the kids' original music. And it was a whole, of course, they would come and they'd say, Lord has given me a new chorus. And, this afternoon when I was in school, and I'd like to share it tonight. And so we were learning the new worship choruses, and we were a whole new style of music was more or less born there, in that move of the Spirit. And
what were some of the early groups or individuals?
Well, of course, there was Odin Fong, and he had been with Timothy Leary down in Laguna Beach in that group that Timothy Leary had down there, and he, of course, formed a group, and then we had Country Faith, Gentle Faith, we had the Children of the Day, we had The Way, we had Isaac Air Freight, we had, of course, they were more of a talking type of a thing, but
and Karen Lafferty, was she involved?
Karen Lafferty, she was involved, not with a group, but just as a soloist.
As a soloist.
And, yes. And Debbie Kerner.
And didn't you used to get nuns, Catholic nuns would come and worship as well?
Oh, well, actually, we had many priests and nuns that did come, yes, and they were quite excited. In fact, I went out into the sanctuary one day, and I saw a group of Catholic priests there in the sanctuary. And Father Nevin from St. Joachim's Catholic Church had brought them over to see the sanctuary, and he greeted me, and I greeted him, and he said, I brought these men are from South Africa, and I brought them over to let them see what the Lord was doing, And most of the time the priest would come in street clothes so that
they wouldn't be identified.
But yes, but they loved the study of the Word of God. And
I understand the media started taking interest. Was it Life magazine?
Well, actually, there were just it was interesting. Life magazine, Time magazine, Reader's Digest, and of course the newspaper had a lot of articles. And we were having this one baptism that was coming up, and we knew that there were about 1,000 young people that were going to be baptized. We had to move from the 19th Street beach. There wasn't enough parking; it wasn't large enough, so we moved to the state beach at Corona del Mar. And so I saw in the Time magazine an article about Black Beach in San Diego, and it was about how some hippies down there had 35 of them had taken off their clothes and to go swimming, in the Buff, and how that the police and so forth, and a big article in Time magazine. And so I was thinking, I really ought to call the religion editor of Time and let them know that there are hippies that are doing more than stripping nude and, swimming in the ocean. There were those that were coming down and being baptized and identified with Christ. And so as I was driving home, I was thinking, well, I need to get hold of the religion editor to, because it would make a good follow-up on that article. And when on my way home, as I was thinking about that, the Lord spoke to my heart and said, "Who's been your public relations agent up till now?" And I said, "Well, you have, Lord." And he said, "Well, aren't you satisfied? I've got you in Time magazine, I've got you in Look, I've got you in Reader's Digest, just in all these articles." I said, "Oh, yes, Lord, forgive me for even thinking of, trying to promote what you are doing." And when I got home, there was a man there in the living room, and he was a writer from Time magazine, and he said, "We want to do an article on the Jesus people. Are you going to have a baptism or anything?" And so the Lord, had been ahead of us, actually. And the Time then had quite an article on the Jesus movement.
That's wonderful. Well, we're at Marietta at the conference center, and Pastor Chuck is about to speak to a bunch of missionaries. Yes. Just looking back, Pastor Chuck, do you have to pinch yourself that all this has happened? You've got missionaries all over the world. You've got churches all over the world. And a lot of it was to do with Kay prompting you.
Right.
What are your feelings now? I mean, you must be just astonished.
Totally. In fact, it's still hard to realize. I mean, the reality of it. It's like, when the Lord returned us from the captivity of Babylon, we were like those who dreamed. And we're sort of like those who are just dreaming as we watch what God has done and what God is doing. It doesn't really sink in completely. You can't really comprehend it fully. It's just you walk around just constant rejoicing in the Lord and in what He has done and in His goodness.
Well, we've been speaking with Pastor Chuck Smith, an astonishing piece of history that I'm sure many of you didn't know anything about. And I am just thrilled that today you can learn a bit of the history of Calvary Chapel, the hippie movement. And finally, Pastor Chuck, just very quickly, who were some of the hippies that came to Christ who people would know now?
Well, of course, there was Greg Laurie, and of course, he's got a very large church out in Riverside. There so many of the pastors, Skip Heisick in Albuquerque, and, of course, Bill Gallatin back in New York, Joe Foch back in Philadelphia. And these men all have tremendously large churches.
Mike Mack, I suppose.
Definitely Mike. And, of course, he was just really a tremendous conversion. I never thought Mike would ever be normal. When he first came, he had been so... his brain has been so fried by drugs that there wasn't much hope for him. He thought there was a hole in the back of his head and that part of his brains were blown out.
Oh, dear.
And he thought you could look in and see his brains from the back, but God healed him completely and, of course, has used him so mightily. Jeff Johnson, who pastors the large church in Downey, he was one of the major drug dealers in Downey. And when he accepted the Lord, he wanted to start teaching the Bible to the guys that he was dealing drugs to. And so he started the Calvary Chapel there in Downey, and hundreds of them across the country, and pastoring major churches today who were once a part of that hippie movement.
What a story. Well,
Yes.
We've been speaking with Pastor Chuck Smith, and it's just a delight to learn this history. I hope that you've been inspired, and maybe we could persuade Pastor Chuck at a later date to take it to the second stage. But the first stage is just so incredible,
Yes.
and I believe on the Calvary Chapel website you can see pictures of the tent and some of the history of Calvary. So I'd encourage you to go there. Is it calvarychapel.com to see some more history? But Pastor Chuck, thank you so much for sharing that, and we will continue to pray for you and Kay.
Thank you, Dan. A joy to be with you.